everyone. Thanks for coming out on sharing your Valentine's Day evening with us. For those of you here live, for those of you watching us on our YouTube channel or on our website or via public television, thank you for joining us whenever that day or time is. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. On behalf of my colleagues Rob Lang and Caitlin Saladino, again, welcome. You see our colleagues from Greenspun College here helping us record this event. It'll be up on our website in a week or so. For the millennials in the audience, and we're glad to see so many of you, Bill's PowerPoint is already up on our Brookings Mountain West website, so do not hurt yourself taking notes on various charts and graphs. You have a source to refer to. And let me turn and welcome our colleague, Bill Frey, who's out from Brookings. Bill's an internationally recognized demographer, and he is written and is known around the world for his research on urban population, migration, immigration, race, age, and particularly his analysis of the US Census. And he's going to, as you can see by the title of our lecture, focus on a millennial generation, but for those of us who are slightly outside of that demographic, I can assure you there'll be stuff of interest to you too. Bill received his PhD from Brown University, and you have either read or in some cases seen Bill himself in every major media outlet and publication, from the New Yorker to Forbes to Time Magazine, et cetera, too long to mention. Most recently, he just had an editorial on this topic in the LA Times. So let me bring Bill up so he can engage us on this important topic.
Thank you. You're probably thinking what I'm thinking. Isn't there a better way to spend Valentine's Day than to come and listen to someone talk about demography? But in fact, it's probably a good way to spend it. I have a confession to make. I am not a millennial. There's a lot of ways that you can classify millennials. We do it in this study, people born between 1981 and 1997. Some people use a longer band for that, but none of them are long enough to include me. I think we'll try to get over that. I hope to get some questions from millennials. How many people here are millennials? Oh, a pretty good crowd. Very good. Now, I just want to say that this talk is just as much for you folks who didn't raise your hands that did raise your hands, because I think there's a lot to know about who millennials are and what the rest of us can do to make lives easier for millennials, because they're a very important resource for us. I got to do this topic because 3 years ago I wrote a book called Diversity Explosion: How New Racial Demographics Are Remaking America. And I wrote the book because after the 2010 census, I was just flabbergasted by how accelerating the diversity in this country has become in all parts of the country, and especially among the youth population. And the point of the book is that diversity is going to be the demographic engine of the 21st century in the United States, along the same way that the baby boom generation had a lot to do with the demography of the last part of the 20th century. But we're in for kind of a wild transition. I think we can see that in some of the politics that both nationally and probably locally in many ways. And as I gave more talks about this book and talked to different audiences ranging from the Marines to political consultants to chambers of commerce to real estate agents and so forth, it came to me that there's needs to be some smooth transition between sort of that generation of the past and this new, more diverse generation. And that it's really the millennial generation that are on the front lines of this change as they achieve, as they become role models and examples, as they're able to overcome barriers of race and ethnicity. This will set the stage for the even more diverse post-millennial generation that's coming along after them. And I think they'll also play a big role in bridging our often divided politics that we're seeing in the country, and they're going to play a bridge along those lines. So I decided that I was going to really launch into understanding better the millennial generation, especially their diversity, because that's a key part of their bridge as we move forward. And so I started to answer these questions. And by the way, there's a report called the millennial generation. I think there's probably a link somewhere, but if not, we can probably put it up, that this talk is based on, and has a lot of this laid out in more detail. I ask, who are the millennials and how distinct are they? I then ask, where are millennials living? And third, how do their socioeconomic characteristics differ? You know, if you read a lot of the major media, you sometimes get the idea that millennials are all young professionals living in Brooklyn. But in fact, millennials are all over the place, and they're not just young professionals. And it's important to know the breadth of the millennial generation rather than just sort of some stereotypes that you read about in the newspaper. And then finally get to this idea is how millennials will serve as a bridge across generations. So I'm going to start with who are millennials and how distinct are they. And here's a chart which shows the racial profile of different age groups. You can see on the left side, people age 55 and over, I'm over 55, I'm in this group, which are largely baby boomers and people who are older than baby boomers, 75% white, and the largest racial minority following this generation are African Americans, not Hispanics. The age group 35 to 54, mostly Generation Xers, although some baby boomers as well, actually have a racial profile that's much like the racial profile of the United States. About 62% white, about 17% Hispanic, 12% black, and 5% or so Asian, pretty much like the US. But as we move further to see the 18 to 34-year-olds, which are the millennials as we define them in this study, they're only 56% white, much more Hispanic, much more Asian population than were some of the older generations, and they're the kind of bridge to then the post-millennial generation, who were in this study under age 18, barely over 50% white. And you can see from that standpoint how the millennials are going to play this bridge. Now, some people look at this just to give you a little bit of demographic background on it and say, well, you know, why are these young people so more diverse than the old people? It may be because we have all these immigrants coming to the United States. Well, that's partially the answer. It's because we had a lot of immigration over the last 25 years. But in fact, today, most of the growth in the Hispanic population and in the minority population is due to births to people who are already here, not immigration. There is already a critical mass of these folks. And as we move further, we're going to see that this diverse population will become even more diverse as more generations go down. Not only because of those immigrants who came from Latin America or Asia or for other parts of the world, but also because the white population is going to start already slow growing, but is going to be starting to shrink, especially at the younger ages. Moving ahead, the only part of the white population that has any kind of considerable growth to it will be the age 65 and over population as more baby boomers move into those years. Already we're seeing declines in whites under age 18 nationwide. So there's a lot of stories about why we're going to continue to be a more diverse population. Okay, just a little perspective here. This is 1980, before there were any millennials. And what I put up here are the baby boom generation. Now, the baby boom generation was probably as celebrated back then as millennials are now, and you can see why. It's just a huge part of the whole population. This, by the way, is like a half of a population pyramid. All those little lines represent the sizes of different age groups going from 0 to 4 up to age 80 to 84. And by 1980, the baby boomers were around the same ages that millennials are today. And you can see how big they were, and you can see how much influence. If you are a baby boomer, you know how much influence the baby boom generation had during those years. About 33% of the whole population were baby boomers in 1980. But if we go to 2015, those baby boomers have moved up into those older ages. They're still around. We're still here. But the millennials are moving into that younger age. And right now, the millennials have a bigger population than the baby boom population. They're not as dominant because the baby boomers are still around, but they're going to be the future. And you can see they're a bigger generation than that generation that's right before them and that generation which is right after them. And the other thing to notice is when you look at that generation that's younger than the millennial population, the white part of the bar, by the way, the bars represent the minority, which is orange, and the gray part of the gray is the white population. The white part of the bar is shrinking as you go down the age groups. And this also talks about and gives us an idea demographically why the diversity of the millennials and the post-millennial generation are going to be very important for our future as they kind of move into the labor force move into other aspects of our society where we have to deal with a much more diverse population nationally. I realize in Las Vegas and in Nevada, a lot of this has happened earlier, but from a national perspective, a lot of people have their eyes opened when they see what's happening to this country in terms of diversity, and this chart sort of makes it the case. Now here's some attributes of the millennial population which I think are important, and something that I call global attributes. 25% of them speak a language other than English at home. That's nationally. It's a bigger share here in Las Vegas, it's a bigger share in California and Texas and Arizona and places like that. But that's still kind of a benchmark, and nationally 1 out of 6 millennials are bilingual, at least 1 out of 6. That means according to the census they speak a language other than English at home, but they also report speaking English very well. And that's a pretty big chunk of the population nationally. About 29% of them are either first or second generation Americans, and about 14%, about 1 out of 7 millennial marriages are multiracial marriages. If you compare that with the baby boomers at the same age, only about 1 in 20 marriages were multiracial marriages. So it's a different kind of generation in many respects. Now there are lots of stereotypes about millennials demographically, and many of them are true. One of them is that it's taking a long time for them to get launched. That is, they are taking a longer time to leave home, a longer time to sort of establish themselves in a career, a longer time to get married, a longer time to have children. And this is just simply generational differences in the percent of millennials aged 25 to 34, the kind of older part of the millennial generation, who are currently married, and comparing the millennials, which are the yellow bar, with the 2 prior generations at the same age. So the blue bar shows you the percentage, for example, of whites who were baby boomers who were married at age 25 to 34, 70%. Then 59% of Generation Xers married at that age, and only 48% of white millennials. If you look at blacks, if you look at Hispanics, and you look at Asians, each of those racial groups, even though they may start at different levels, continue to go down. Now some of that has had to do with the economic circumstances millennials had to deal with. The first millennial turned age 27 in 2008, which is almost right when the Great Recession started, when the housing crunch turned around. And so, a lot of that millennial generation who's passed through their 20s and into their early 30s now have had to deal with all of that. Some of that has put their careers and in their lives on hold a little bit. So there's 2 aspects of this later marriage. One is it gives a lot more flexibility and independence. The other, though, it gives kind of a later start in kind of a traditional life cycle. But it is endemic to all of these millennial groups. Another stereotype, which is absolutely true, is millennials are the most educated young adult population that we've ever had. Again, the same kind of chart which shows a percent at age 25 to 34 of different generations who have a college education. Again, for whites, millennials, 43% have college educations. Baby boomers, only 27% of them had a college education at that same age. And if you look over at the Asian population, 63% of Asian millennials have college educations. Only 42% of baby boom Asians had a college education at that same age. So that's the good news part of this chart. The not so good news part of this chart is a very sharp racial disparity in educational attainment. You can see that for the Hispanic population in particular, but also for the black population, a very large gap. Now, every year when the numbers come out, there is improvement, particularly with the Hispanic population. There are fewer high school dropouts, there are more Hispanics going to college, or at least to something that's post-secondary, and that's very good. But I think this is something to keep an eye on because of the very large diversity of our millennial population. This disparity in educational attainment is something to deal with. There are lots of roots to this. Some of the studies done at UCLA by Gary Orfield in the Civil Rights Project looks at school segregation patterns in the United States. And it's quite clear that although school segregation isn't the only indicator of sort of underfunded schools, it often is, and especially for Hispanics in particular, but also historically for blacks, being in an underfunded segregated school does not get you off to a good start. It's also the case that if you're going to college, it's nice to have check in the mail from your parents every once in a while. Well, that's not as likely sometimes for for some of these minority populations as it is for kids growing up in the suburbs and more well off. And for many millennials, of course, the whole idea of college debt comes into the picture, and we've seen that as well. So I think all millennials, some aspects of all millennials categories have some college debt to deal with. So there's some real issues to deal with here because education is such an important indicator and marker for how well you're going to do later. A similar thing has to do with home ownership. You know, once again, millennials are kind of behind the 8 ball on home ownership, again, because it's taken them so long to get going. As you'll see if you look at the larger report, historically how millennials have much lower rates of home ownership than either Gen Xers or baby boomers at the same age. The mortgage meltdown made it more difficult to get a decent interest rate, a decent mortgage, and then the fact that many of them did have college debt and they aren't getting the kind of help from their parents that they might get has put them in rented homes or maybe in their parents' basements that everybody seems reading about. But there are still these racial disparities, and racial disparities have gotten wider as a result of the Great Depression or the Great Recession and its effect on millennials. 56% of whites own homes of the millennial generation, age 25 to 34, compared with 33% of blacks. Hispanics and Asians are in between. So if you look at both education and home ownership, these are two markers that have a lot to say about how well you're doing in the future, both your income stream but also in your wealth creation over time. And we do have these large racial disparities. And of course, as we saw demographically, when we look at the racial profile of people who are moving into their 20s and early 30s, not only millennials but also post-millennials, these minority populations, Hispanics in particular, are an ever widening part of that population. And you know, this is something, if we're talking about investment in the future for our country, some of them already have families, but also as they're younger, their families need to be thought about in terms of how we're going to deal with the future. We have a very important resource in this country that they don't have in Japan, that they don't have in Germany, that they don't have in Italy. Those countries are aging very rapidly, sort of late to the game. They're bringing in some immigrants. Sometimes they're not welcomed there very much. But compared to us, their populations are aging. Many of them already have negative growth in their labor force populations. We don't have that problem in the United States. And the reason we don't have this problem is because we've had this young minority population, which are now bubbling up as millennials. And it's a very important resource that we have to take care of. So I'm just going to stop on that one there. Let's get to the next question. And where are millennials living? And here is what I've done is looked at the metropolitan areas that had the fastest growth in millennials, or at least in young adult population, between 2010 and 2015. Those dark dotted places are the top 10 fastest growing young adult growth areas, and the white ones are the slowest growing young adult areas. It's probably not surprising that the fastest growing ones are in the South and the West, and the slowest growing ones for the most part are in the Midwest or the interior part of the South. About 5% of the young adult population grew between 2010 and 2015. But those dark colored, faster growing metropolitan areas all grew by more than 10% over the 2010 to 2015. And there are places like Seattle and Denver, Austin, Houston, some Florida metropolitan areas. Colorado Springs is number one. When this report first came out, it got a lot of attention in the local newspaper in Colorado Springs for some reason or another, so it got some notoriety. We didn't know we had the fastest growing millennial population. The ones that are the slowest growing millennial population, you'll see places like St. Louis and Chicago and Milwaukee and Syracuse. Only Birmingham, Alabama, of the 100 largest metropolitan areas, have a negative millennial growth, and 2 states have a negative millennial growth, Illinois and West Virginia. But it differs. This is for the total millennial population. It differs for different racial groups. So for example, if you look at whites, those metropolitan areas have the fastest growth for white millennials are all in the West and South: Dallas, Denver, Houston, San Francisco, and Seattle. Many of them are sort of traditional magnets for millennials that you read about, places like Denver and San Francisco. For blacks, it's our different set of metropolitan areas, or somewhat different set of metropolitan areas, led by Atlanta. Atlanta's always been a big magnet in the last decade or so for black migration, and it is also a big magnet for black millennial migration. Also Dallas and Houston, Washington, D.C., and New York are places that are gaining blacks. For Hispanics, tend to be the places that already have large numbers of Hispanics is where you see a lot of millennial growth, like Houston, LA, Miami, San Antonio, and so forth. Similarly for Asians, the places that have the biggest gains in millennial Asian populations are places that already have pretty substantial Asian populations, LA, Houston, New York, San Francisco, and so forth. There's a very sharp disparity across the country in the racial profile of millennial populations. And here's a map of the United States. All of those red states, there's 10 of them, are what you call minority white millennial populations. California, for example, only 30% of California's population is white. The rest are different racial and ethnic groups other than whites. And similarly, of course, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and some in the east, including New Jersey and Maryland. So there's only a few states that are more than 80% white among their millennial population, places like Wyoming and Iowa, some of the New England states you can see there. And here's some metropolitan areas to give a sort of range. LA, only 27% of the millennial population is white. A very big chunk, almost half of it, are Hispanics. Las Vegas coming close to 37% white, big Hispanic chunk. But if you look at Atlanta, it's African Americans that are a big, big segment of the millennial population. And then you get to a place like Minneapolis, St. Paul. Yes, that is a somewhat whiter millennial population, but still somewhat diverse as we see over time. Another way to look at this is the racial profiles of urban and suburban areas. Now this accumulates all the big metropolitan areas together, but it shows you the breakdown of the racial composition of the urban core as you further go out to the mature suburbs and the emerging suburbs, and the exurbs are much whiter than the urban core population. But I haven't put a slide up here by that. When you look at the growth of the millennial population in all of these parts of the metropolitan area between 2010 and 2015, racial minorities make up over half of that growth. So even though we see this disparity across areas in the kind of whiteness or the persons of color in these areas, they are over time all going to become more racially diverse as a result of this overall minority growth as we see over time. So there is this stereotype of white millennials gentrifying in cities. I think when you see a lot of the media, it's not always the case when you look at this. Now I'm going to get to the socioeconomic characteristics of millennials. And here we're going to look at the education percent college graduates among 25 to 34. Nationally, about 36% of millennials have college degrees, those aged 25 to 34, and about 39% of women millennials have college degrees. But in Boston, 58% of millennials have college degrees. And if you go down the coast, again, these darker dotted metropolitan areas are the ones that have the highest. All of those that are sort of the dark dots have at least 45% of their millennials with college degrees. And down the East Coast, you see Hartford, New York, Washington, D.C., and Raleigh, North Carolina, and some college towns like Madison, Wisconsin. There's Minneapolis, St. Paul, Denver, San Jose, and San Francisco. At the other side of the spectrum are 10 areas where less than 25% of the millennials have college degrees. Several interior California places like Bakersfield, Fresno, Stockton, Riverside. Las Vegas falls into this group. It's 21% for Las Vegas. 21% of millennials have college degrees, and then a few in Florida. So there's a lot of, broad stretch of areas have college degrees, and I think among millennials. So I think when you're looking at how millennials are going to contribute to your economy and how they're going to contribute to your labor force, it's important to look at the educational profiles, what needs to be done, what kinds of opportunities should be made for them, both for further education, but also the kinds of jobs that they can take that are right there. It's going to be a much different deal in Minneapolis, St. Paul than it's going to be in Bakersfield, California, and also shows what you need to do perhaps to catch up to some of those places in terms of attracting people or helping to educate your homegrown population a little bit better. And now I'm going to talk about the bridge across generations. And this is sort of my sermon on all of this. Let's get back to something I call the cultural generation gap. I've written about this before in my Diversity Explosion book. And what I'm talking about here is we can talk about generation gaps in general. when I was in my youth in the 1960s, the generation gap was, you know, people had different kinds of musics. Baby boomers had different kind of musics than their parents. They were always rebellious about one thing or another. And there was this idea of what the generation gap is. Today, you know, the generation gap for millennials are quite different in terms of their attitudes about the establishment. They're somewhat anti-establishment in general with respect to government or political parties or religion. They tend to embrace things like the legalization of marijuana or same-sex marriages a little more than the older generation does. But to me, one of the bigger gaps has to do with the race and ethnic profiles, because it's a signal of other things culturally that are different among these different groups. And so here again, this is sort of a variant of the chart I first showed you, but it compares all the premillennials, people over age 35, these are 2015 numbers, and with millennials, with the post-millennial population. And so 68% of those premillennials, including baby boomers, Gen Xers, and people older than that, are white, 56% of millennials and only 52% of post-millennials. And I just say this as a backdrop when we think about attitudinal surveys that are done by, say, the Pew Research Center, which shows that white baby boomers and their older generations put together, over half of them think that newcomers to the United States from other parts of the world could be a threat to American values, a threat to American customs. They think more so than other generations that there's too big of a flow of immigration from Latin America or from Asia. And they also have attitudes about government spending. They don't think it's important to spend government spending on a lot of the social programs that are important for young people. You know, they are okay with Social Security and Medicare, but I think, you know, there's this kind of image that these aren't our children, these aren't our grandchildren, why should we spend our tax money on this? And you know, you can think of some of it this way. You know, when I was in the 1950s, when I was just a young guy, immigration was pretty low in the United States. It was down to about 5%. You know, immigration was a big, kind of peaked in the teens and in the 20s, 1920s, and that kind of during the Depression, World War II, it sort of sunk down. We had different kinds of immigration laws. The only immigrants I knew were grandparents of my young friends who came to the United States at the turn of the previous century from Italy or Poland or someplace like that. The biggest minority group in the US back then were African Americans, and they were living in very, very segregated quarters for most of the United States. And so if you grew up as, you know, a young white person in the US, unless you were living in like New York or in the middle of Miami or something, you didn't come into contact with a lot of different people from different areas. And I think some of that still is in the back of the heads of people who are now in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Certainly not all of them. It's not my case. Not a lot of people that I know. A lot of the people that take surveys don't feel that way. But enough of them to have some resistance to contributing and investing into the future of a lot of these young folks. And you know, if we can go back to the election of 2016, Donald Trump's message of "Make America Great Again," that had a lot of aspects to it. It wasn't just this. I mean, I think a lot of people felt they were left out of the economy, that here's someone coming along that can help them bring back manufacturing jobs that were lost over the years and make their wages higher and all of that. But a piece of that was addressing their fear of the changing demographics in the United States. Sort of messages about immigration restriction, about tougher policing, sort of critiques about political correctness are the kinds of things that resonated with people who were just felt, you know, the country is changing too much for me. Here's somebody that kind of understands that and may make it better. Well, you know, the good part of the cultural generation gap is that the younger part of the generation has a very different idea about this. The results of the last 3 presidential elections showed two won by Barack Obama, the third one by Donald Trump. In each of those, the population over age 40 voted Republican, the population under age 40 voted Democratic, and in that case for Democratic candidates that were much more open about immigration and about social safety net issues and the role of government for social programs and so forth. There were certainly other issues, but it's kind of interesting that these last 3 elections made that a little sharper, that age divide a little bit sharper over time. You know, millennials on those same kinds of surveys are much more open to the role of government, they're much more open to immigration, they're much more open to things like inclusiveness. Here's I want to skip this one, there we go. Here's a survey done by the PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute. They have something called a values survey every year. And here they ask people, you know, since 1950, has American culture changed mostly for the better or mostly for the worse? And what I compare here, the yellow bar represents the under 35 adult population. The blue bar is the over 35 adult population. And you see on the left-hand side for the total, you know, the under 35, which are essentially millennials, more than half of them think, yeah, it's changing more for the better. For the over 35, a little less. But what's interesting, that's also the case within the white population. That is, younger whites are more open to these kinds of changes than older whites. So it's not just a matter of the racial composition of each of these generations. It's also the case for people within these generations that have this kind of view. Other surveys show, for example, older whites don't have a very good view of Black Lives Matter. Younger whites do. They have a very positive view of Black Lives Matter. So these kind of changes that we see, I think, are very important. It's useful to know that, at least among the millennial generation, at least in a survey done by the Harvard Institute of Government, when they were asked, do they think they should do more to help unite the country, or are they okay with the way the country is divided? Very strongly, millennials say that they would like to do more to unite the country. Now, this cultural generation gap that I talked about is different values in different places. So I put this together to show the cultural generation gap, which is the percent white who are over age 35 compared to the percent white who are under age 18, with the millennial population sort of in between. They're not part of it. And of course, nationally, when we look back to it, the under 18 population is 52% white. The over 35 population is 68% white. But here are some states that have a bigger gap. And you know, Arizona tops the list, and you can imagine why Arizona might demographically. After all, they get a lot of these old retirees from other parts of the country to increase the size of their older population, but also over the years, not only through immigration, but spillover from California and other states of racial minorities. And so you have a pretty hefty cultural generation gap there. Also in New Mexico, Nevada pops up there, Rhode Island, Oklahoma, so all kinds of things happen. But Arizona is a good case because Arizona has had a lot of conflicting politics with respect to race and immigration over the years. Back in 2010, proposed state law 1070, the Save Our State, which had one of its provisions that people could be stopped for a normal traffic stop and be risk for being detained or deported. Some of those provisions were struck down by the Supreme Court. A lot of them were, but the fact that they came up right away shows that there's this kind of divide that occurs, you know, sort of naturally with some of this happening. And I see we're going to have an election next year where Sheriff Joe Arpaio is going to run for the Senate, probably with a lot of other candidates with a lot of other views for things. So I think when you look at nationally, if you think of the dispersion of the new minority populations, by new minorities I mean Hispanics, Asians, people of two or more races, to the middle of the country. It's happened, you know, for the last several years, not just Nevada, which has been happening for a long time, but for other places like Utah, Colorado. But when you get even to the Midwest, you're seeing more of the dispersion going there. That those are the places, usually the newer groups are younger. People who migrate tend to be younger than to be older. And then their kids are going to school and so forth. And that sort of brings along some of these cultural generation gaps. There was a study done by a group called First Focus in Washington, D.C. that used my measure of the cultural generation gap and tried to make a correlation between that and the support in different states for public education. And they found a pretty strong correlation that the higher the cultural generation gap, the less support there was for public education. So, you know, the kinds of issues younger people are interested in, investment in education, affordable housing, reform for immigration in an inclusive way, may be different than the kinds of issues the older populations tend to be interested in. Lower taxes, keeping the Social Security thing intact. You know, this is a broad brush, and there are lots of other things that make it much more complicated. But this is at the root of some of it, and I think it's important to understand the demography of all of this and the role that millennials could play in all of this. Well, let's talk about projections ahead. This is the projection of the U.S. in 2015. And what we see is what we saw before. The millennials are there with smaller cohorts beyond them. Let's go to 2025. Millennials won't be 18 to 34. They're going to be 28 to 44. And when we get to 2035, they're going to be 38 to 54. So now, about half the population is older than millennials. But in 2035, about half the population is going to be younger than millennials. They'll have gone through all of these years. And what's going to become of them? Well, there's still going to be a bridge between a much whiter, older population and a much more diverse, younger population. Even in 2035, when millennials are in their 40s and early 50s, the generations behind them are going to be much more diverse. They're going to be minority white, all of them, and those ahead of them are just going to be, 65% white. This shows that they're going, as they move through these 20 years, you millennials, as you move through these 20 years, you're going to make a big difference in how the rest of the country sees diversity as you make your way across those pathways. And I think, if you look at it this way, rather than just millennials as just being young people sitting around with Ubers and everything, I mean, it's really kind of important to understand that this diversity of their generation is important. Now here's Nevada. It's a little bit of a different thing for Nevada. Again, the millennials are getting older, but you'll notice there's another bump when you get to 2035. It keeps bumping outward. I mean, it's one thing about demography is when you have sort of a big generation of young people, they then, reproduce another generation, somewhere down the road. And that's much more of an impact in Nevada than it was for the U.S. as a whole. And of course, Nevada's population there's a much bigger minority share of all those young ages than there was for the U.S. as a whole. But there is this kind of cultural generation gap in Nevada too. 2015, more than half of the older than millennial population was white. 43% of millennials were white, only 37% of post-millennial whites. So both millennials and the post-millennials are minority white populations. By 2035, all of them will be minority white populations. But again, millennials will be somewhat more of a transition into that period when we look at it. And then here's kind of a look at today, or 2015, of different metropolitan areas, because I've been talking mostly about the nation. And it does matter, of course. Los Angeles, even though it's minority white all around, there's still a division between those ages. It's the millennial population where Hispanics are more than half of that group, which wasn't the case for the premillennial population. And then that ushers in a different kind of population for the younger group. Atlanta, the black population, also gets augmented by more Hispanics over time among the younger population. Chicago as well, you see a bigger Hispanic population moving in over time. And of course, Las Vegas has a profile somewhat like Los Angeles. It's a little bit whiter overall, but you see that the case. So if we think about this over time, where do we stand? I mean, you think about millennials and you read about all kinds of generalizations about them. You can do a LexisNexis search or a social media search every day, and there's dozens of articles, sometimes hundreds of articles about millennials. It's millennials in the title that gets picked up. There's all kinds of things about millennials. They're never going to own a house, they're never going to own a car, they have different views about things, all of this. But to me, the most important legacy they're going to have is how they serve as a political and social and economic bridge between the generation ahead of them and the generation behind them. And I think they're off to a good start. As I said, they're the most educated generation that we've seen in these young adult years. But they also have to deal with the fact that there's still very big racial and social and economic gaps with respect to education, with respect to home ownership, with respect to poverty, with respect to income. And those are things that they're going to have to face, they're going to have to overcome. But also those of us who did not raise our hands at the beginning of this talk, who are not millennials, are also going to have to help them overcome those kinds of hurdles, because we are going to be dependent on them. We're dependent on them for making our economy better, for putting their money into Social Security, into Medicare, and to being good stewards of all of the good values we have in this country for the generations that follow. And most importantly, we're going to have to help them to overcome this cultural generation gap which now pervades our politics in the United States, which I think can be overcome. But I am optimistic that this is going to come out well. One of the reasons I'm optimistic is because millennials themselves are optimistic. A survey done by a University of Chicago group called Gen Forward asked millennials whether they think they were going to do better than their parents economically. And as it turns out, all of them did, but the ones who thought that the most were the minority millennials, Hispanics, blacks, and Asians felt they were going to do better than their parents economically, and that their generation would do better than their parents economically. The other reason why I'm optimistic is because I'm a demographer, and I always think that demography is destiny. And when you look at the demography here, it's pretty clear that this country is going to become much more racially diverse over time, that those of us who aren't millennials, those people who are in power, not some just academic like me, but somebody who actually can make decisions and do things, will understand this and understand that investment in this generation will be important, especially as millennials themselves become leaders in industry, leaders in government, major figures in popular culture, and as the face of America to the rest of the world. I think that will come out okay, but we just have to give them a little bit of slack as we get there. So that's it. Thank you. So I'm told I can take some questions here if people have them. Yes?
Wonderful talk. I think one of the things that's also in the middle of the debate now, but I think one of the things that is going to be very important, and we talk about having affordability of housing, affordability, staying at home instead of getting a job, is the fact that, of course, over that same period of time, we've gone from a production economy to what they like to call a consumption economy. We don't have nearly the diversity of production we used to have because a lot of it's imported. So the question that I would ask then is, again, if we have a more balanced picture there, more balanced imports and more production here, it gives more opportunities. There's a bigger range, not just consumption-based part of the economy, but production also.
Sure. No, I think that's important. We have to look at these kind of macroeconomic forces and trade forces when we're looking ahead, and irrespective of who our workers are, the jobs have to be there, and I think that's an important piece of it. But of course, the other part of it is we make sure these folks are prepared to take those jobs when we have them. Yeah.
If I understand your information correctly, what is the destiny for Las Vegas when 79% of the millennials do not have an advanced degree or college education?
Yeah, well, I think that this is also a challenge to places that have been getting a lot of new generations, maybe first or second generation Americans here, who's maybe doing better than their parents were, and they want to make sure that their kids are doing better than they are, to provide them with opportunities. There's two ways to increase the educational attainment of a population. One is to grow your own, and the other is to attract them from other places, and I think you need to make efforts to do both of those things. I mean, part of the reason the way it is right now, as I said, it has to do with the population flows that have come in, striving people who are trying to do better but need to do more. And maybe the kinds of industries and the kinds of jobs that are here tend to attract those folks. And both of those things together, I think you can make improvements over time if you keep your eye on the ball. I mean, you're not going to become Boston in 5 years, okay? Going from 21% college graduates to 58%, but you might get up to 30%, and that would be okay. Yeah, back there.
What's the economic effect of these demographic studies where you have such not diversity, but such inequality in economics between these various groups?
It's not a good thing, and what you need to do, and that's why I'm pointing to these younger generation, because they're going to be with us for a long time, and to the extent we can do what we can to close it for them, it will behoove all of us to make those kinds of efforts. It's not what it ought to be, but as I went back and said before, we have a different scenario than countries which are aging rapidly and don't have young populations. And they're going to be in much worse shape than if we make the effort to make these young folks, and it starts with education, but also social services and things like child care that could be subsidized for their families, and other things that, we don't hear talked about a lot in the public arena. We hear about immigration, or we hear about, something else. But I think if you look close to the head at the demography and the opportunity we have, it won't be easy, okay? It's not going to be easy, but I think that's the kind of effort we need to make. Yes?
Yeah, could you run your measure of cultural gap bias again? And if it's, as I suspect, longitudinal measure, don't generational attitudes change as they age? And how does that affect your projections?
Yeah, well, no, that's true. I mean, I think if you think of the baby boomers today, a lot of it, I wasn't there, but a lot of us were at Woodstock, for example, you know, which is not kind of a, some people there, conservative kind of group. I mean, but, you know, people do get older and they have different views and they have to pay taxes and they get responsibilities and all of that. But I also think that this young population may not outgrow some of their ideas about inclusion just because of the nature of the fact that they are so diverse and they're all in mixed race marriages and mixed race social networks and understand why that's all important. So that's part of the group dynamic of their situation, which I think will continue over time, even if they get to be a little more stodgy than they are today on some of the other values. So there's, looks like a millennial there. I don't know, are you a millennial?
I am a millennial.
Okay.
So with the 2020 census coming up and reapportionment of congressional seats, you know, Nevada's going to be in a seat, New York's going to lose a seat, so forth. How do these migration flows kind of reshape the map? You know, you said Texas was one of the places. Does that become a swing state? Do you get, you know, 2 new Democratic seats out of Dallas and Houston and so forth, or Miami or Nevada's a swing state? Anything like that you can mention?
Yeah, I mean, you know, what I showed here was just sort of the population growth differences in millennials in different places, but actual migration flows include other ages too and are more directed than what I've shown here. But, you know, from what I've seen from the population estimates, you're going to see many Sunbelt states, Texas, Florida, maybe Georgia, I don't know about Nevada, but it may be possible, you know, get more seats. I mean, it used to be that you'd think, you know, from a national perspective, the Democratic states were losing and the Republican states were winning, because in the past, in a good part of the South and in the good part of the West, those states tended to be Republican. That kind of flipped in a lot of places over the last 3 elections. Nevada is a good case in point, when, you know, being Republican for a while in the last 3 elections, voted Democratic, and now several Democratic members of the House of Representatives and so forth. And probably could flip in Georgia, maybe even Arizona at some point. North Carolina and Florida. And so, you know, if that were the case, then at least from a national perspective and an electoral college perspective, then there would be more advantage to the Democrats from this. At the local level, you know, how congressional districts get remade, that's very political, as you may know. And so even if a state gets a couple seats, it kind of matters who's in the state, depending how the state defines the redistricting that goes on within the state. And often in some states, and I think Texas is one of them, unfortunately, that a Republican state legislature could play tricks with those numbers. So, you know, in a perfect world, yes, if we get more gains in some of those states that are turning Democratic, then you would say that would bode well for the Democratic population and for these more highly diverse states, which are the ones that are typically growing very rapidly. Okay.
Don't want to miss anybody. One last question or two?
Oh, please. Two questions. First one, you didn't mention anything about how to get millennials out of the basement. The serious question. So we're more polarized than we've been since, let's say, the Vietnam War. Help me understand how the millennials are going to help depolarize it. Is it just by their population growing? Is that basically it, and they're going to have more power?
Well, you know, the very simple answer, they can start turning out to vote in big numbers, and I think that way they're going to sort of help change, you know, some of the more very negative kinds of laws and regulations that, you know, are divisive in their nature. But the other way, I think they can show by example that they can do the job. And, you know, as I showed with that projection, between now and the year 2035, they're going to be moving into their 40s and early 50s. A lot of us, if we're still around, will be retired, and we're going to have to depend on them to make those kinds of decisions. And I think they're up to it. And when that happens, I think they're going to make things a little easier with respect to these transitions. But it may be bumpy along the way. I agree.
Is there one in the back there?
Yeah, here. So correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand correctly, each generation is more diverse than the other, right?
Up till now, yes.
So I'm wondering if there's anything, aside from the fact that we're more diverse than previous generations, which is, as we just said, inevitable, that you think makes us the catalyst for changing our diversity, if you will.
Well, you know, I think that's a big deal to be more diverse than in the previous generations because, you know, in the past we've had sort of new immigrants coming into the U.S. at the turn of the previous century, but they usually were white ethnics. Now, some of them thought of them as being racially different than kind of the white Anglo-Saxon base that we had in our country. But now the new millennial population and the people after them are very different. They're not just white ethnics. They come from very different backgrounds and as a result, to be here means that they have to kind of be open to those changes, and they are open to those changes according to all these surveys, and be much more inclusive in their attitudes about things. It's not always that way. I mean, there's kind of fights between different factions within the Latino community or between blacks and Hispanics in different places like that. But I think, you know, it bodes well for them having that kind of attitude and, you know, creating a sort of a marketplace of, you know, whatever it is, ideas or how they deal with their community issues. That'll be much different than we've had in the past. And so I think that, you know, they're going to have to, there'll be problems as well, but I think that diversity itself, especially with the fact that, as I said, the white population is shrinking in those age groups, is going to have a lot to do with, you know, the way we're going to deal with, you know, other kinds of problems as we go forward. Okay.
Let me thank you, Bill, for your time. Thank you all for both your attendance and your questions. Let me put in a unsolicited commercial for Bill's book, The Diversity Explosion, where he goes into great depth on all of this. For those of us in the UNLV community, you can just either physically or electronically visit our library and get access to this. My apologies to your publisher, I'm not selling any books for you there. But do check it out. And if you can, join us on March 7th when we have our next lecture, which is a great follow-up to Bill's talk. We'll have our colleague Richard Reeves back. And it was just a year ago that Richard published Dream Hoarders, which is a look at economic and social mobility in the United States. Who has it, who doesn't, and what does our nation actually look like? And so he'll expand on that with a focus specifically on our Intermountain West region. So he'll look at Las Vegas, Salt Lake, Denver, Phoenix, and drill down, as Bill did, on Nevada here. So I hope I see you all on the 7th. Thanks again for coming. We can take off your microphone.